So Tometek, or Tometek, maybe it's Tometek because it's Tom Electronics, abbreviated. They sent me a box I thought was interesting because most of the time I'm reviewing mini PC hardware, it has like, you know, N5105 or N6005, or, you know, hopefully some newer ones I get with the N100 or N305 at some point. But this one actually uses an Atom processor, which I thought was interesting because I've always wanted to try an Atom processor. I always just kind of dismissed them as, you know, just low power devices that might be useful in certain, you know, niche cases, right? You know, Atom processors have gotten more powerful over time, and they are a little more power efficient potentially than some other processors that have similar performance, but they're still like, I think this one's still like maybe, you know, 15 watt TDP. So it's not maybe the lowest one, but let me show you this box, what it looks like here. So this is the Tometek TC300-TTG. There's different models that have similar model numbers. So this is the model that has two 2.5 gig interfaces and four 10 gig SFP plus interfaces. These are actually i225 chipset. So hopefully it's version 3, since the other previous versions are not so good. When I looked up these 10 gig SFP plus interfaces, it said these were embedded as part of the Atom processor. So I've noticed on some of the server hardware, the CPUs, the network interfaces are often, you know, built in as part of the architecture because they're used for server applications. So on the back you have your 12 volt DC power, and you have a console port and a power button and two USB 3.0 ports. Notice there's no display connection on this device. So that's an interesting thing about this device. It has no GPU in it. No GPU. So you have to install the operating system with the console. That's the only option to get stuff on this system. And I mean, you could take maybe the drive out, install it, you know, maybe preload something and put it in here, right? That would be the only other way to get something on here, which is, that's a pain, right? So it comes with a serial console cable. It's a USB on one end, and it goes to Ethernet on the other end. So I'm glad that Tometek includes this cable with it. That's the only way you can install anything. You definitely want this cable. It's critical to have. And of course, it comes with a power brick, like most devices of this size. Because it doesn't have a GPU, Tometek told me that this system does not get quite as hot because it's actually a fanless unit. I reviewed other boxes that have 10 gig SFP plus interfaces, and they have fans in them. This is the first one I've seen with no fans. That's why in the Protectly VP6650 video, I said it's practically impossible to have a box with SFP plus cages, fanless, without having overheating issues. And then in the video I said, well, maybe not completely impossible, because after I recorded the video, I found out I was going to be getting this box. So I went back, I went and edited that statement in there, because I made kind of an absolute statement, which is generally not good to do anyway. But I wanted to do that because I knew this one is going to be fanless, and it's technically possible. And so we'll see how, because it doesn't have, like, say, other components in it, like a GPU, which produces heat as well. And that's what their claim is, that the lack of GPU actually helps reduce heat enough where it seems like it'll be fine. So that'll be interesting to test. As I mentioned earlier, this has the Atom processor. It's the Atom C3758R, and it's an 8-core Atom processor. This thing can support up to 64 gigs of RAM with 2 modules. I only got 16 in it. The chassis of this, I've noticed, it's a little bit bigger than some of the other mini pieces. You can see it's a decent size. It's kind of wide and long, more rectangular than some of the mini PCs I've seen. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of, heat dissipation that's going to happen here, and maybe it's fine because of the way that it doesn't have a GPU integrated into this. Inside the Tometek, you'll see that here's my RAM modules, where I have 2 8 gig modules. I have a M.2 SATA that's 64 gigs, and you can see there's 2 slot connectors here. One can be for Wi-Fi, one can be for 4G LTE, so you can have those connectivity options. I believe there's 2 SIM cards that you can plug into there. I saw that in the specs. And then there is a connector for a SATA disk, because if you want to add a SATA disk, you can. If you notice over here, I'll pan over to this is the cover for it. You can see where the screw holes are for the SATA disk, and if you flip this over, you can screw it in from the back side of the case. This is the bottom of the case. So you have to unscrew the bottom of the case. And here's your 10 gig SFP Plus modules. You can see that these are integrated in. And you have two I225 Ethernet interfaces here. It's interesting over here, looks like there's places for different types of chips that they could add on for different models. Maybe that's probably how they reuse some of these circuit boards. I forgot to mention the one up here is the power connector for the SATA disk. It's not next to the SATA port, but it's up here at the top. So that's pretty much the inside of this model here. As for power consumption, you can see on this chart, it looks like it's idling about 13 watts. There's a few spikes about 16 watts, like say if I reboot the system. And I think I only had like one Ethernet interface plugged in, so this will go up a little bit if you're plugging in all the SFP Plus interfaces. So keep that in mind. The TDP rating for this processor is 26 watts, so it's like half that when it's idling with nothing really plugged in. So that's good to see that this seems to be pretty power efficient compared to some of the systems, because even at 16 watts, that's not too bad either. Because like, for example, the Protectly VP6650, I notice it kind of hovers more in the 20 some watt range. So it just depends on what interface you have plugged in. If you add any extra, discs and those sorts of things, that'll ramp up the wattage a little bit. On the bottom of this box, they have like little places where the feet's kind of raised, but it's part of the metal. So if you want to have this setting, say on a server rack or something, you'll probably want to put rubber feet on the bottom. I've been doing that with all my devices. Makes it nice so things don't slide around in there when you're trying to plug stuff in. I thought about using it as a 2.5 10 gig test client. Since it's got a lot of interfaces here, that would be kind of nice just to like test other devices using this one. That might be where I might want to use this, for a project idea. Sometimes I've had problems installing, some of these operating systems with the serial method of installing it. Even though they provide that option, OPNsense was one of the few that went on smoothly, and I was impressed with how well that actually worked. And so, that you can give them some kudos. I'm sure PFSense might work well. I haven't tried that. As I go along in this video, I'll let you know like what difficulties I had installing stuff on just a serial only connection. You'll see that I'm at the grub menu for the Proxmox installer. There's a graphical option, and then there's two terminal UI options. One of them is a serial console option, but if I use that option out of the box, it locks up, it seems like, or at least freezes on the network interfaces for some reason. It won't go past that part of the booting process. Tometek has a list of parameters, which I have showing here, that they recommend setting up for the serial console. And so I actually went to the terminal UI option right here, and then edited that option and added the parameters that Tometek recommends entering, and I had success with installing Proxmox using that method. So if you go down to the terminal UI and hit the E key, you'll see that these are the parameters for the boot menu options. And you want to go down to the Linux line, but one thing first, before you hit the arrow keys, it says this is an Emacs-like screen editing. I had to look up what the Emacs command keys are, because for some reason I was getting weird results with the arrow keys, and it would just jump me back to the other menu and is inserting random characters and stuff like that. So if you hit Control-N, it'll take you down to the Linux line if you keep hitting Control-N several times. And then Control-F will move the cursor forward one. That's why I really hate editors like this. That's why I don't like Vim and stuff like that, because it doesn't use the usual shortcut keys. It's just hard to get used to moving around and editing that way. Once you got used to it, maybe it's easier than other ways. But anyway, so you hit Control-F, it'll take you all the way to the end of the line. Just hold it down, we'll scroll across, and then this spans to the next line right here where it says VGA equals 788. And then we'll go one past that, because that gets you to the end of the line. And then because if you hit it again, it'll take you to the next line. We'll hit the space bar, and let's move this over here, because we can't copy and paste into this PuTTY window as far as I know. I tried doing it earlier. So we'll just type it in. Notice down here it'll say hit Control-X or F10 to boot. So you just hit Control-X, and then it'll boot properly into the Proxmox installer. You'll see that you have a text editor version of the Proxmox installer, which is not nearly as pretty, but it works. You just hit I agree and hit next, and you can just go through the menu options just like you would the fancy pretty installer, and it works just fine. It just, you had to get those boot menu options correct in order to get this to work properly, which is a little bit of a pain, but it works. You only have to do it one time, and then Proxmox will load successfully. As you can see, I got Proxmox 8.2 installed. by tweaking a couple of the parameters in the boot menu when I was installing it. So now we're at the Ubuntu server's grub menu, and all it has is try or install Ubuntu server. So we're going to edit this option similar to what we did with Proxmox, and we'll just hit E. And notice if I hit the arrow keys on this editor, even though it says it's an Emacs editor, it actually works using the arrow keys. So that's great. I can actually jump over here. I don't have to do any control, N or control F to move around the cursor. So it's easy. I can just go here to go to VM Linux, Linux, whatever that is, right? So we'll put a space here, and then we can type in this same parameters that we had for Proxmox over here, and this should work out so we can get the Ubuntu server installed. When you're done, hit Control X. And it should boot successfully, because if you don't do that, you would not even get this far. It just kind of hangs immediately, and it says some kind of message at the top. Even though this installer seems to be doing pretty well, I noticed when I got near the end, it would just crash, as you'll see here in a minute. I couldn't figure out what the problem was. I tried Ubuntu 20.04, 22.04, and 24.04, and none of them seemed to work. After trying this again, I was able to get Ubuntu to install properly. So as you can see, it'll be booting up here soon, and it's working properly. I realized after working on this video earlier that my IPv6 configuration for some reason on my network is not working quite right, and I didn't touch it in a long time. So I noticed that during the Debian installer, it would just kind of hang there, but then I saw that it was trying to reach out to IPv6 addresses, and then I did an IPv6 check online, and it wasn't working. So it seemed like to me that the Debian installer defaulted back to IPv4 gracefully, and the Ubuntu installer must have tried IPv6 in the background trying to download something or whatever, and it kept crashing. And so once I turned off IPv6, it just worked properly, and I was able to finish the installation. I still have trouble getting the 10 gig interfaces going, but sometimes I wonder if it's a combination of a driver needs updated, because that seemed to help me with Debian, but it also seems like to me it could be just picky DAC cables and those sorts of things. That's the bad part about SFP modules, is there's a lot of incompatibility issues that you could run into. So those are some things to look out for when you're doing this. So I decided to try Debian Linux, because it's what Ubuntu is based on, and it's usually they have slower updates, more stable base operating system that a lot of these operating systems are built upon. So I thought I'd give it a shot, and it actually did work. Once I used once I put these commands in right here to be able to get to the console access. There's some extra little steps you have to do compared to Proxmox, because when I installed it via the serial console with Proxmox, even when I used the commands, I could still see the console after I rebooted the system. I didn't have to do anything extra. But the Tometek instructions states that after you do the boot menu tweaks temporarily, you need to go and edit the grub menu to make them permanent later after you have the operating system installed. It's interesting I didn't have to do that for Proxmox, but I think I have to do that for Debian, because I noticed that it doesn't it boots in blind mode and you can't see anything on the console. You can still get to SSH and all that kind of stuff, anything services you have running on the server, so it still works. But if you want to have console access, you gotta tweak these settings again. Right, and then Control X, and it should start booting in, because otherwise I would say blind mode and you don't see anything, which is not helpful at all. All right, so looks like it took us to the prompt, and then it immediately showed us that we are connected to the network, which is fine. To make the changes permanent in Debian, to get the console to work properly, you'll need to go to the etc default grub file and edit it, and on where it says the grub command line Linux default, it says quiet. This is where you need to enter in the parameters for the serial console, so you will just type all those in. What I'm going to do for this one, I'm going to use a quote for the Linux part, because a single quote, because you don't want to double quote too many things there. It already has quotes. Okay, Control O, enter, Control X. After editing the grub menu is run this update grub command. Let's test this out. Yep, it looks like it worked because otherwise you wouldn't see any of this output. So that's great. So now we made our change permanent. So let's do a quick speed test from my PC to this box and we'll see what we get. So I'm doing reverse mode, so it's going to send data from this box to my PC, and we'll see that we're getting 8.72 gigabits. We're getting close to 9. Okay, now it's ramping up. It looks like 9.39. That's looks like about the theoretical max for 10 gig. I don't have jumbo frames enabled, so that's definitely the full throughput. It's kind of interesting. The first few seconds, I kind of had to ramp up a little bit, I guess. But once it did, I'm getting full throughput, which is nice. Let me do it not in reverse mode. And I want to show you something interesting that I found. And I think I saw this on the Serve the Home, one of their posts, that some people said they were getting fast speeds in one direction. And that's what I saw here is if I'm sending data to the box, it's at 3.47 gigabits. I'm looking at 3.5 gigabits. I've seen this with other devices before, like the Zima board, where it's just a slow CPU and it can't keep up with the single threaded processes. But if I would do multiple streams or multiple windows open, it would handle processing it. I'm not sure if this is a single core getting saturated and it can't handle it, so maybe it handles multiple streams better. All right, so I want to speed test with 2 different streams. I found it works best if I do 2 separate windows like this, 2 separate instances. Even though you can do parallel streams, I feel like that doesn't always give the most throughput from my experience. I don't know if it's a limitation of using this console window, if it's single threaded, even though iPerf could be multi-threaded, those sorts of things. So I just do 2 separate port numbers, like I'm using the default one here and then 5202. That way when I run both of them, I'm running 2 separate instances on the server and 2 separate instances on the client. And then we can combine the 2 speeds and you can see what throughput we're getting. So let's do this one, start it, and we'll start this one. As you recall, like from the previous test, I was only getting 3.5 gigabits on a single stream, but for some reason I've noticed is very interesting that I'm getting about almost 4.5, 4.6 gigabits on each one. So if I combine these 2 together, that's like 9.2 gigabits, which is a full throughput, 10 gigabit throughput. That makes me wonder if it's like a single threaded limitation on this system. So I'm wondering if that is the problem with the performance. So it can handle multiple streams pretty well, but a single stream, it can't do full throughput when it's receiving data. So I decided to do a quick speed test on OPNsense across 2 different network interfaces, and it seemed like I was getting about the same results as you can see with Debian when sending data to the box itself. It was getting about 3.5 gigabits. It looks like I'm getting about 3 gigabits going across the 2 network interfaces. So this is without IDS or IPS or anything like that. It's just the default installation. So this will be a little bit disappointing if you're hoping to saturate 10 gigabits. Maybe when it's sending data out of the box and there's multiple streams, you can get closer to 10 gigabits, but just the default installation, you're going to get like maybe 3 gigabits. I decided to enable hardware acceleration in OPNsense, to see if I get better performance, which is not recommended to do that if you're going to do IDS or IPS, because NetMap, it needs to route the packets through the CPU instead of being processed by the network adapters. So, I noticed if I did parallel streams, I can get, 6 gigabits. I can double the throughput, it looks like, by running multiple streams through. So maybe it seems like it does help with the performance. That's one option to consider if you're not interested in IDS or IPS and you just want pure routing and firewall capabilities in OPNsense. You might be able to get some extra throughput that way. And just keep in mind that if you get multiple streams on your network and not just from a single system, you might get even greater throughput than this, as I've kind of demonstrated with the Debian speed test earlier with 2 different separate streams and 2 different windows. One thing to note about Debian Linux, to get the 10 gig interface to work for my speed test, I had to actually go in here and install and download the drivers and install them, which takes a little bit of time, but it did seem to solve the problem because I did a clean installation to make sure it wasn't some other configuration, and it did not, recognize the network interfaces. It would not, connect or anything to the network. And even I tried configuring the IP addresses, but it seemed to work pretty well when I downloaded this and ran the compilation. Once I figured out which interface was the proper one, because they're not in order on the box itself. So I used these instructions on how to install the ixgbe driver on Ubuntu or Debian. And it seemed to work pretty well. Just downloaded this file. I just followed all these steps here. And at the end, it took a while to actually compile the driver itself. But once I did this, it seemed like it worked pretty well. The bad part about this is you have to recompile the drivers every time you have a new kernel version of Linux, but you can actually, down here, it tells you, where's it at? Yeah, tutorial, you can use DKMS to automatically rebuild the image. And there's further instructions on how to set that up. I'm not sure if it just will do it by default, if this is already set up on Debian, or if you have to do some special tweaks to get DKMS working. That's another step I just didn't really go for because I was just testing this box out. And that's just a little gotcha you want to keep in mind here if you are building the drivers from scratch. Even though things didn't go quite as smooth as I had hoped, I still was able to get the software set up on it, and I think it would make a nice low power server for various applications. And it didn't seem to get too hot whenever I was testing it out. Thanks for watching as I check out some different products like this, and it's kind of fun to play around and see what they can do. I like learning the capabilities of these different boxes and devices, because a device such as this that has an Atom processor may not be good for an OPNsense box, but it might be great as a Proxmox server, for example, or some other application, and you won't really know that until you try it out. So until next time, I'll see you in the next video.